Chapter 25 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25, Passing on the Torch. The last year of Susan's presidency was particularly precious to her. In a sense, it represented her farewell to the work she had carried on most of her life, and at the same time, it was also the hopeful beginning of the period leading to victory. Yet she had no illusion of speedy or easy success for her girls, and she did her best to prepare them for the obstacles they would inevitably meet. She warned them not to expect their cause to triumph merely because it was just. Governments, she told them, never do any great good things from mere principle, from mere love of justice. You expect too much of human nature when you expect that. The movement had reached an impasse. The temper of Congress, as shown by the admission of Hawaii as a territory without women's suffrage, was both indifferent and hostile. That this attitude did not express the will of the American people, she was firmly convinced. It was due, she believed, to the political influence of powerful groups opposed to women's suffrage. The liquor interests controlling the votes of increasing numbers of immigrants, machine politicians fearful of losing their power, and financial interests whose conservatism resisted any measure which might upset the status quo. How to undermine this opposition was now her main problem, and she saw no other way but persistent agitation through a more active, more effective, ever-growing women's suffrage organization, reaching a wider cross-section of the people. She herself had established a press bureau which was feeding interesting factual articles on women's suffrage to newspapers throughout the country. For as she wrote Mrs. Colby, the suffrage cause needs to picture its demands in the daily papers where the unconverted can see them rather than in special papers where only those already converted can see them. Of greatest importance to her was winning the support of organized labor. Samuel Gompers, the president of the American Federation of Labor, had already shown his friendliness toward equal pay and votes for women, and was putting women organizers in the field to speed the unionization of women. Even so, she was surprised at the enthusiasm with which she was received at the American Federation of Labor Convention in 1899, when the 400 delegates, by a rising vote, adopted a strong resolution urging favorable action on a federal women's suffrage amendment. So far as possible, she had always established friendly relations with labor organizations, first in 1869 with William H. Silvis's National Labor Union, and then with the Knights of Labor and their leader, Terence V. Powderly. When Eugene V. Debs, president of the American Railway Union, was arrested during the Pullman strike in 1894, for defying a court injunction, she did not rate him, as so many did, a dangerous radical, but as an earnest reformer, crusading for an unpopular cause. They had met years before in Terre Haute, where, at his request, she had lectured on women's suffrage, and immediately they had won each other's sympathy and respect. She did not see indications of anarchy in the Pullman and Homestead strikes, or in the Haymarket riot, but regarded them as an unfortunate phase of an industrial revolution which in time would improve the relations of labor and capital. That women would be affected by this industrial revolution was obvious to her, and she wanted them to understand it and play their part in it. For this reason, she saw the importance of keeping the National American Women's Suffrage Association informed on all developments affecting wage-earning women, and to her delight, she found 3 young suffragists wide awake on this subject. One of them, Florence Kelley, had joined forces with that remarkable young woman, Jane Addams, in her valuable social experiment, Hull House, in the slums of Chicago, and was now devoting herself to improving the working conditions of women and children. She represented a new trend in thought and work, social service, which made a great appeal to college women and set in motion labor legislation designed to protect women and children. Another young woman of promise, Gail Laughlin, pioneering as a lawyer, approached the subject from the feminist viewpoint, seeking protection for women not through labor legislation based on sex, but through trade unions, the vote, equal pay, and a wider recognition of women's right to contract for their labor on the same terms as men. Her survey of women's working conditions, presented at a convention of the National American Association, was so valuable and attracted so much attention that she was appointed to the United States Labor Commission. Harriet Stanton Blatch also understood the significance of the Industrial Revolution and women's part in it, and she too opposed labor legislation based on sex. Coming from England occasionally to visit her mother in New York, she brought her liberal viewpoint into women's suffrage conventions with a flair of oratory matching that of her gifted parents. "The more I see of her," Susan remarked to a friend, "the more I feel the greatness of her character." Although it was Susan's intention to hew to the line of women's suffrage and not to comment publicly on controversial issues, she could not keep silent when confronted with injustice. Religious intolerance, bigotry, and racial discrimination always forced her to take a stand, regardless of the criticism she might bring on herself. The treatment of the Negro in both the North and the South was always of great concern to her, and during the 1890s, when a veritable epidemic of lynchings and race riots broke out, she expressed herself freely in Rochester newspapers. She noted the dangerous trend as indicated by new anti-Negro societies and the limitation of membership to white Americans in the Spanish-American War Veterans Organization. Whenever the opportunity presented itself, she put into practice her own sincere belief in race equality. During every Washington convention, she arranged to have one of her good speakers occupy the pulpit of a Negro church, and in the South she made it a point to speak herself in Negro churches and schools and before their organizations, even though this might prejudice Southerners. In her own home, she gladly welcomed the Negro lecturers and educators who came to Rochester. This seeking out of the Negro in friendliness was a religious duty to her and a pleasure. She demanded of everyone employed in her household respectful treatment of Negro guests. She rejoiced when she saw Negroes in the audience at women's suffrage conventions in Washington, and it gave her great satisfaction to hear Mary Church Terrell, a beautiful, intelligent Negro who had been educated at Oberlin and in Europe, making speeches which equaled and even surpassed those of the most eloquent white suffragists. Susan did not fail to keep in touch with the international feminist movement, and in the summer of 1899, when she was 79 years old, she headed the United States delegation to the International Council of Women, meeting in London. Visiting Harriet Stanton Blatch at her home in Basingstoke, she first conferred with the leading British feminists, bringing herself up to date on the progress of their cause. In England, as in the United States, the burden of the suffrage campaign had shifted from the shoulders of the pioneers to their daughters, and they were carrying on with vigor, pressing for the passage of a franchise bill in the House of Commons. Moving on to London, she was acclaimed as she had been at the World's Fair in Chicago. "The papers here have been going wild over Miss Anthony, declaring her to be the most unaggressive woman suffragist ever seen," reported a journalist to his newspaper in the United States. From China, India, New Zealand, and Australia, from South Africa, Palestine, Persia, and the Argentine, as well as from Europe and the United States, women had come to London to discuss their progress and their problems, and Susan, pointing out to them the goal toward which they must head, declared with confidence, "The day will come when man will recognize women as his peer, not only at the fireside, but in the councils of the nation. Then, and not until then, will there be perfect comradeship between the sexes that shall result in the highest development of the race." She had hoped that Queen Victoria would receive the delegates at Windsor Castle, thus indicating her approval of the International Council. She longed to talk with this woman who had ruled so long and so well. That a queen sat on the throne of England, this in itself was important to her, and she wanted to express her gratitude, although she was well aware that the Queen had never used her influence for the improvement of laws relating to women. She had hoped to convince her of the need of votes for women, but Queen Victoria never gave her the opportunity. All that influential Englishwomen were able to arrange was the admission of the delegates to the courtyard of Windsor Castle to watch the Queen start on her drive and to tea in the banquet room without the Queen. Returning home late in August 1899, Susan began at once to make definite plans to turn over the presidency of the National American Women's Suffrage Association to a younger woman. Although she well knew that the choice of her successor was actually in the hands of the membership, it was her intention to do what she could within the bounds of democratic procedure to ensure the best possible leadership. To fill the office, she turned instinctively to Anna Howard Shaw, whom she loved more dearly as the years went by, and whose selfless devotion to the cause she trusted implicitly. Yet Anna, in spite of her many qualifications, lacked a few which were exceptional in Carrie Chapman Catt: creative executive ability, a diplomacy, a talent for working with people, directing them, and winning their devotion. With growing admiration, Susan had been watching Mrs. Catt's indefatigable work in the States, where she had been building up active branches. Her flair for raising money was outstanding, and Susan realized, as few others did, the crying need of funds for the campaigns ahead. In addition, Mrs. Catt had no personal financial worries, for her husband, successful in business, was sympathetic to her work. Anna, on the other hand, would have to support herself by lecturing and carry as well the burden of the presidency of a rapidly growing organization. Anna made the decision for Susan. She urged the candidacy of Mrs. Catt, although her highest ambition had always been to succeed her beloved Aunt Susan. As she later confessed to Susan, this was a personal sacrifice which cost her many a heartache, but she honestly felt that Mrs. Catt was better fitted, as well as freer to go into an unpaid field. Susan therefore approached Mrs. Catt through Rachel and Harriet Upton, and was relieved when she consented to stand for election. Rumors of Susan's retirement aroused ambitions in Lily Devereux Blake, who from the point of seniority and devoted work in New York was regarded as being next in line for the presidency by Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Colby. Unable to visualize Mrs. Blake as the leader of this large organization with its diverse, strong personalities, Susan nevertheless conceded her right to compete for the office. Although she appreciated Mrs. Blake's valuable work for the cause, there never had been understanding or sympathy between them. Temperamentally, the blunt, stern New Englander, with untiring drive, had little in common with the Southern beauty turned reformer. A change in the presidency needed wise and patient handling, as personal ambitions, prejudices, and misunderstandings reared their heads. When there were murmurings of secession among a small group if Mrs. Catt were elected, Susan wrote Mrs. Colby that such talk was very immature, very despotic, very undemocratic, and she hoped she was not one of the malcontents. Another problem was the future of the organization committee, which under Mrs. Catt's chairmanship had carried on a large part of the work. Its influence was considerable and could readily develop so as to conflict with that of the officers, thus threatening the unity of the whole organization. To dissolve the committee seemed to Susan and her closest advisers the wisest procedure. Mary Garrett Hay, who had worked closely with Mrs. Catt on the organization committee, opposed this plan, but after earnest discussion the officers, including Mrs. Catt, agreed to dissolve the organization committee. As Susan appeared on the platform at the opening session of the Washington Convention in February 1900, there was thunderous applause from an audience tense with emotion at the thought of losing the leader who had guided them for so many years. The tall, gray-haired woman in black satin, with soft, rich lace at her throat, and the proverbial red shawl about her shoulders, had become the symbol of their cause. Now, as she looked down upon them with a friendly smile and motherly tenderness, tears came to their eyes, and they wanted to remember always just how she looked at that moment. Then she broke the tension with a call to duty, a summons to press for the federal amendment, and one more plea that they always hold their annual conventions in the national capital. Difficult and sad as this official leave-taking was, she had made up her mind to carry it through with good cheer. Tirelessly she presided at 3 sessions daily. With the pride of a mother, she listened to the many reports, and with particular satisfaction to that of the treasurer, which showed all debts paid and pledges amounting to $10,000 to start the new year. Susan herself had made this possible, raising enough to pay past debts and securing pledges so that the new administration could start its work free from financial worries. I have fully determined to retire from the active presidency of the association, she announced when the reports and speeches were over. I am not retiring now because I feel unable, mentally or physically, to do the necessary work, but because I wish to see the organization in the hands of those who are to have its management in the future. I want to see you all at work while I am alive, so I can scold you if you do not do it well. Give the matter of selecting your officers serious thought. Consider who will do the best work for the political enfranchisement of women, and let no personal feelings enter into the question. Watching developments with the keen eye of a politician, she was confident that Mrs. Catt would be elected to succeed her, although Mrs. Blake's candidacy was still being assiduously pressed, and circulars recommending her, signed by Mrs. Stanton, Mrs. Russell Sage, and Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, were being widely distributed. Just before the balloting, however, Mrs. Blake withdrew her name in the interest of harmony. This left the field to Mrs. Catt, who received 254 votes of the 278 cast. A burst of applause greeted the announcement of Mrs. Catt's election. Then, abruptly it stopped, as the realization swept over the delegates that Aunt Susan was no longer their president. Walking to the front of the platform, Susan took Mrs. Catt by the hand, and while the delegates applauded, the two women stood before them, the one showing in her kind face the experience and wisdom of years, the other young, intelligent, and beautiful, her life still before her. There were tears in Susan's eyes, and her voice was unsteady as she said, "I am sure you have made a wise choice. New conditions bring new duties. These new duties, these changed conditions, demand stronger hands, younger heads, and fresher hearts. In Mrs. Catt, you have my ideal leader. I present to you my successor." Susan's joyous confidence in the new administration was rudely jolted as controversy over the future of the organization committee flared up during the last days of the convention. Under strong pressure from Mary Garrett Hay, Mrs. Catt had counseled with Henry Blackwell, and at one of the last sessions he had slipped in a motion authorizing the continuance of the organization committee. Stunned by this development, and looking upon it as a threat to the harmony of the new administration, Susan, supported by Harriet Upton and Rachel, prepared to take action, and the next morning, at the first post-convention executive committee meeting at which Mrs. Catt presided, Susan proposed that the national officers, headed by Mrs. Catt, take over the duties of the organization committee. This precipitated a heated debate, during which Henry Blackwell and his daughter Alice called such procedure unconstitutional, and Mary Hay resigned. As the discussion became too acrimonious, Mrs. Catt put an end to it by calling up unfinished business, and thus managed to steer the remainder of the session into less troubled waters. The next day, however, Susan brought the matter up again, and on her motion the organization committee was voted out of existence with praise for its admirable record of service. Here were all the makings of a factional feud which, if fanned into flame, could have well split the National American Association. Not only had the old organization interfered with the new, indirectly reprimanding Mrs. Catt, but Susan, by her own personal influence and determination, had reversed the action of the convention. As a result, Mrs. Catt was indignant, hurt, and sorely tempted to resign. But after sending a highly critical letter to every member of the business committee, she took up her work with vigor. Disappointed and heartsick over the turn of events, Susan searched for a way to re-establish harmony and her own faith in her successor. Realizing that a mother's cool counsel and guiding hand were needed to heal the misunderstandings, and convinced that unity and trust could be restored only by frank discussion of the problem by those involved, she asked for a meeting of the business committee at her home. "What can we do to get back into trust in each other?" she wrote Laura Clay. "That is the thing we must do, somehow, and it cannot be done by letter. We must hold a meeting, and we must have you and every single one of our members at it." Impatient at what to her seemed unnecessary delay, She kept prodding Mrs. Catt to call this meeting. Fortunately, both Susan and Mrs. Catt were genuinely fond of each other and placed the welfare of the cause above personal differences. Both were tolerant and steady and understood the pressures put on the leader of a great organization. Anxious and troubled as she waited for this meeting, Susan appreciated Anna Shaw's visits as never before, marking them as red-letter days on her calendar. Late in August 1900, all the officers finally gathered at 17 Madison Street, and Susan listened to their discussions with deep concern. She was confident she could rely completely upon Harriet Upton, Rachel, and Anna, and could count on Laura Clay's level head and good common sense. She never felt sure of Alice Stone Blackwell, and knew there was great sympathy and often a working alliance between her father, and Mrs. Catt. Of the latest member of the official family, Catherine Waugh McCullough, she had little first-hand knowledge. Mrs. Catt, whom she longed to fathom and trust, was still an enigma. During those hot, humid August days, misunderstandings were healed, unity was restored, and Susan was reassured that not a single one of her girls desired other than was good for the work. Susan had always been a champion of coeducation, speaking for it as early as the 1850s at state teachers' meetings and proposing it for Columbia University in her Revolution. In 1891, she and Mrs. Stanton had agitated for the admission of women to the University of Rochester. 7 years later, the trustees consented to admit women provided $100,000 could be raised in a year, and Susan served on the fundraising committee with her friend Helen Barrett Montgomery. Because the alumni of the University of Rochester opposed coeducation, and the city's wealthiest men were indifferent, progress was slow. But the trustees were persuaded to extend the time and to reduce by 1/2 the amount to be raised. With so much else on her mind in 1900, including the sudden death of her brother Merritt, she had given the fund little thought until the committee appealed to her in desperation when only 1 day remained in which to raise the last $8,000. Immediately she went into action. Remembering that Mary had talked of willing the university $2,000 if it became coeducational, she persuaded her to pledge that amount now. Then, setting out in a carriage on a very hot September morning, she slowly collected pledges for all but $2,000. As the trustees were in session, and likely to adjourn any minute, she appealed to Samuel Wilder, one of Rochester's prominent elder citizens who had already contributed, to guarantee that amount until she could raise it. To this he gladly agreed. Reaching the trustees' meeting with Mrs. Montgomery just in time, with pledges assuring the payment of the full $50,000, she was amazed at their reception. Instead of rejoicing with them, the trustees began to quibble over Samuel Wilder's guarantee of the last $2,000 because of the state of his health. When she offered her life insurance as security, they still put her off, telling her to come back in a few days. Even then they continued to quibble, but finally admitted that the woman had won. Disillusioned, she wrote in her diary, "Not a trustee has given anything, although there are several millionaires among them." Only her life insurance policy and her dogged persistence had saved the day. This effort to open Rochester University to women, on top of a very full and worrisome year, was so taxing and so disillusioning that she became seriously ill. When she recovered sufficiently for a drive, she asked to be taken to the university campus, and afterward wrote in her diary, As I drove over the campus, I felt these are not forbidden grounds to the girls of the city any longer. It is good to feel that the old doors sway on their hinges to women. Will the vows be kept to them? Will the girls have equal chances with the boys? They promised well. The fulfillment will be seen, whether there shall not be some hitch from the proposed to a separate school. Still keeping her watchful eye on the National American Association, Susan traveled to Minneapolis in the spring of 1901 for the first annual convention under the new administration. There was talk of an entire New Deal, the retirement of all who had served under Miss Anthony, and the election of a new cabinet of officers. And Susan was so concerned that there might also be a change in the presidency that she felt she must be on hand to guide and steady the proceedings. Mrs. Catt was re-elected, and Susan returned to Rochester well satisfied and ready to devote herself to completing the 4th volume of the History of Women's Suffrage, on which she and Mrs. Harper had been working intermittently for the past year. It was published late in 1902. While working on the history, Susan, although more than satisfied with Mrs. Harper's work, often thought nostalgically of her happy, stimulating years of collaboration with Mrs. Stanton. She seldom saw Mrs. Stanton now, but they kept in touch with each other by letter. In the spring of 1902, she visited Mrs. Stanton twice in New York, and planned to return in November to celebrate Mrs. Stanton's 87th birthday. In anticipation, she wrote Mrs. Stanton, "It is 51 years since we first met, and we have been busy through every one of them, stirring up the world to recognize the rights of women. We little dreamed when we began this contest that half a century later we would be compelled to leave the finish of the battle to another generation of women. But our hearts are filled with joy to know that they enter upon this task equipped with a college education, with business experience, with the freely admitted right to speak in public, all of which were denied to women 50 years ago. These strong, courageous, capable young women will take our place and complete our work. There is an army of them where we were but a handful." 2 weeks before Mrs. Stanton's birthday, Susan was stunned by a telegram announcing that her old comrade had passed away in her chair. Bewildered and desolate, she sat alone in her study for several hours, trying bravely to endure her grief. Then came the reporters for copy, which only this heartbroken woman could give. "I cannot express myself at all as I feel," she haltingly told them. "I'm too crushed to speak. If I had died first, she would have found beautiful phrases to describe our friendship, but I cannot put it into words." From New York, where she had gone for the funeral, she wrote in anguish to Mrs. Harper, "Oh, the voice is stilled which I loved to hear for 50 years. Always I have felt that I must have Mrs. Stanton's opinion of things before I knew where I stood myself. I am all at sea, but the laws of nature are still going on, with no shadow or turning. What a wonder it is! It goes right on and on, no matter who lives or who dies." National women's suffrage conventions were still red-letter events to Susan, and she attended them no matter how great the physical effort, traveling to New Orleans in 1903. Of particular concern was the 1904 convention because of Mrs. Catt's decision at the very last moment not to stand for re-election on account of her health. Looking over the field, Susan saw no one capable of taking her place but Anna Howard Shaw. Not to be able to turn to Mrs. Stanton's capable daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, at this time was disappointing. but Harriet's long absence in England had made her more or less of a stranger to the membership of the National American Association, and for some reason she did not seem to fit in, lacking her mother's warmth and appeal. "I don't see anybody in the whole rank of our suffrage movement to take her, Mrs. Catt's, place but you," Susan now wrote Anna Howard Shaw. "If you will take it with a salary of, say, $2,000, I will go ahead and try to see what I can do. We must not let the society down into feeble hands. Don't say no, for the life of you. For if Mrs. Catt persists in going out, we shall simply have to accept it, and we must tide over with the best material that we have, and you are the best. And would you have taken office 4 years ago, you would have been elected overwhelmingly." Anna could not refuse Aunt Susan, and when she was elected with Mrs. Catt as vice president, Susan breathed freely again. It warmed Susan's heart to enter the convention on her 84th birthday to a thundering welcome, to banter with Mrs. Upton, who called her to the platform, and to stop the applause with a smile and, "There now, girls, that's enough." Nothing could have been more appropriate for her birthday than the Colorado Jubilee over which she presided and which gave irrefutable evidence of the success of women's suffrage in that state. There was rejoicing, too, over Australia, where women had been voting since 1902, and over the new hope in Europe in Denmark, where women had chosen her birthday to stage a demonstration in favor of the pending franchise bill. For the last time, she spoke to a Senate committee on the women's suffrage amendment. Standing before these indifferent men, a tired warrior at the end of a long, hard campaign, she reminded them that she alone remained of those who 35 years before, in 1869, had appealed to Congress for justice. "And I," she added, "shall not be able to come much longer." "We have waited," she told them. "We stood aside for the Negro. We waited for the millions of immigrants. Now we must wait till the Hawaiians, the Filipinos, and the Puerto Ricans are enfranchised. Then, no doubt, the Cubans will have their turn. For all these ignorant alien peoples, educated women have been compelled to stand aside and wait." Then, with mounting impatience, she asked them, "How long will this injustice, this outrage, continue?" Their answer to her was silence. They sent no report to the Senate on the women's suffrage amendment, yet she was able to say to a reporter of the New York Sun, "I have never lost my faith, not for a moment in 50 years." End of chapter 25.